Welcome everybody to another edition of Community Connections. I'm your host, Dan Salzer, and today I'm joined by the chair of the Plymouth Planning Board, and John Crist. John, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
We're here to look at the housing opportunity planning and the housing project here in the town. And first of all, kind of what is the housing study that's been taking place?
Yeah, so we're just embarking on a housing study. It's been going for a few months now. And so the Planning Board and the Housing Committee have been working to better understand our housing stock in Plymouth, our housing needs, and our ultimate goal will be to undertake a regulatory audit and try to understand how we can better meet the needs of the community and its housing needs for community members, for workers, and others.
So John, what has really transpired? What kind of got the ball rolling to have this housing study done?
It's important for a town on a periodic basis to take another look at its housing stock, its housing needs, and figure out how to move forward. In this case, we were lucky that the state received federal funds, which the governor has set aside through Invest New Hampshire to look into housing issues. And one portion of that is to look into housing regulations and how they can be improved to spur more investment in housing in communities. And so several members of the town, two of us on the planning board and two members of the planning staff put together an application, and it was approved. And so we received the HOP, the Housing Opportunity Planning Grant, and that money has been used so we can embark on this study. And we have hired a consultant at this point who is working with us, Barrett Planning Group, and so far this has been a really incredible relationship. And the goals of this project, as outlined in the grant and as we're moving forward, are to first take an assessment of, as I've been mentioning, our housing stock, our housing needs. Part of that is demographic statistical information, and a large part of that is also public outreach and trying to learn what the community perceives to be its needs, its desires, and other input it might have that can help us understand the housing situation in Plymouth. And throughout this whole process, the community engagement component is going to be really key to understanding our housing. I mean, ultimately, there's only so much you can really understand by looking at the numbers. And so we want to dig deeper than that. And Barrett Planning Group has been really an invaluable resource in that process. And then from there, again, with the help of our consultant, Barrett Planning, we will look into our current regulations, our zoning ordinance, site plan regulations, subdivision regulations, to see what else might be changed there to further encourage more housing development, to meet the needs of housing, and even more so to make sure we're meeting those needs in a way that addresses the community's desires and the community's vision for what Plymouth is and can be. So the ultimate goal then is to get suggestions for regulatory changes to our zoning ordinance and other documents that can help spur that development. And so just to step back for a moment, many of you probably know that the nation as a whole is experiencing a housing crisis. Mm-hmm. And that includes New Hampshire, and that includes Plymouth. And so in some ways, just like every other community across the nation, we have to find a way that people can be housed. We have, again, as many people probably know, raising and rising costs for housing. And so housing is becoming increasingly unattainable for various income levels. And even when you do have the money to spend on the housing, the availability often is just not there. And so we want to make sure that people can come here to live, to work, to retire, whatever it is they might want to do here. We want to make sure we are a welcoming community and that we do so in a responsible way through that public outreach throughout the process.
I'll go into kind of what are some of the issues. You think of Plymouth as a whole and look at the entire nation. It's sort of that rural community still, even though it's a microcosm of kind of the overlook of everything. There are so many different kind of pockets and demographics of housing in this town. What are some of the issues that have come up over the years or you guys are starting to see here with this study?
I should answer that first by saying that as a member of this committee, I don't want to go too far in what I perceive to be the needs of this town and shape that conversation and color the results before we even go into these conversations. Mm-hmm. So a large part of, I think, my role here is to listen more than it is to speak to these issues. There will come a time further down the road in this process, later this year into the fall, summer and fall, when I think we're a bit more in the driver's seat in terms of taking all that community input and trying to transform it into something. But for now, I think it's really important to listen and to hear what other people perceive to be those needs and challenges, and we definitely want to get that input as much as we can. That being said, we're part of this broader housing crisis, and there are definitely things that make Plymouth unique. There's a university and what it means to house a large population of students, and how that looks, how that shapes the town's character. We're also a kind of hub for various services like the hospital and retail needs, and for people in the workforce. And so there are lots of issues there, and I'm sure anybody watching this probably has had conversations about a lot of the deeper issues that face the town that I don't really want to get too much into at this point. And I should say at this point also that just to kind of give us a heads up on where we are in this process and in terms of what we do know about some of the input that we've gotten and what I perceive to be the needs. So at this point, Judy Barrett of the Barrett Planning Group has conducted a series of interviews with members of the community, primarily larger stakeholders and people in HR departments and people involved in housing that might be able to speak to some of the broader issues. And so we've gotten a lot of early input already. And so we've heard about a lot of these issues, and we haven't gotten a full report back, and we're still kind of tying up some loose ends, and Barrett Planning Group especially is tying up those loose ends with a few more interviews like right now in terms of collecting some of that early data. And some of that data will, in a kind of preliminary way, be presented probably at our first community meeting. Mm-hmm. But again, I think it's important not to color too many of those conversations more than they already have in the many conversations that happen like every week around this town around certain issues.
I want to dive a little bit deeper into those initial findings with Barrett Planning Group and the interviews that were conducted. I believe it was around 30 individuals that were interviewed over the course of a week. What sort of initial things kind of continuously popped up in each of those interviews, and kind of what's the initial outcome of things?
So this speaks to a little bit of what I was just speaking to, and I mean there are the inevitable things that will come up, relationships with the university, parking, and so forth. I mean, again, it's one of those things I don't want to go too deeply into, but yes. Judy Barrett from Barrett Planning was here for several days and doing extensive interviews, and the feedback I've heard from the people who were part of those interviews was really very, very encouraging. And encouraging in the sense that those who were interviewed seemed to really be excited to talk about these issues, and encouraging because we know the firm that we're working with to undertake this project is really doing a wonderful job in outreach. And I mean, the individuals I've spoken to, most of them were saying, yeah, we could have talked for hours about this. And that's the kind of thing you want to hear, that those you have on board in the community and on the professional end, both are really engaged and able to carry those conversations forward.
You mentioned about the community meetings, and the first one coming up being Thursday, April 6th, 6:30 p.m., doing the plug right there. That'll be at the Plymouth Elementary School in the cafeteria for your next meeting. Talk to us how that meeting is going to be conducted. What are you as the board and Barrett Planning Group expecting from the public, or what is the public expecting of the board during that meeting?
Yeah, thank you for the plug. And we do want as many people to show up as possible. So there are a few different goals, but the main goal is going to be community discussions, and it's why we're calling the community meeting. And so there will be an introduction primarily by Barrett Planning, and if I forget, remind me to speak a little bit more about why we're working with Barrett Planning. So Barrett Planning will be providing everyone with an introduction to the process, to the housing study, and what the goals are, and I believe providing a bit of kind of preliminary feedback on some of those early interviews that we've had. But the main goal then will be to hear what you, the members of the community, feel about this. So that first dive we had with these interviews was a more targeted focus on certain stakeholders. And at this point, we really do want to hear as broadly as possible from the community. If you think this might not be for you, show up, it's for you. And we do want to hear from as many people as possible. So what that will look like is there will be certain kind of preliminary activities as people come in to get some initial feedback about who they are and why, and like maybe where you're located in the town and certain things like that. And there'll be some more of an introduction from the Barrett Planning, and then we will move into kind of breakout sessions where individual tables of people will be working with members of the planning board and the housing committee as moderators, facilitators, to ask certain questions and get as much feedback as we can. And there'll be somebody else with each table as well. The two people with each table also taking notes on all these conversations that are held, which can all eventually kind of feed back into this process. And there'll be a few other parts as well, but it'll be a packed, I hope enjoyable evening of getting lots and lots of feedback. Because really, if we want this process to work well, and work well for everyone in the community as well as possible, we need as much community input as possible, so we know what you all want in this process. And to return to Barrett Planning,
You just beat me to it.
I wasn't sure if I'd remember. This is a major undertaking to do a housing study like this, and to do it right especially, and with all this community outreach and demographic research and other statistical research and looking at the market. This is a lot of work. And looking at the planning board, and then as we've assembled the housing committee, all of these boards and committees of volunteers, at some point, to do it well gets beyond our capacity. Mm-hmm. And to have a professional planning group on hand as a consultant to help us with the heavy lifting and work with us has been absolutely invaluable. We really couldn't do it well and take this deep a dive into all this material without that extra staff on hand, and it's been wonderful.
A little bit more in depth on that, and people want to know, why was Barrett Planning Group chosen for this project and Judy Barrett, and was there a kind of a process of elimination? How did that whole kind of process go to find this group?
Yeah, so a little bit of background then. So this grant came up, and as I mentioned earlier, the planning staff and a couple planning board members, myself included, put together an application. When I was accepted, we had a $134,000 grant to work with, which was wonderful. And then we assembled a committee so we could take a little bit of the pressure off the planning board and also have a broader scope of the community. So it was a few members of the planning board and other members of the community, including representatives of certain stakeholders, that came on board to form this committee, and we've been working, meeting weekly, bi-weekly, as need be at various parts in this process so far. And there was a list of kind of preferred consultants for this process. You could go outside of it, but it's kind of more streamlined to go within it. And it was a pretty extensive list, and we were looking through it, and we just, as a committee, started narrowing it down. And in the end, we had a first and a second round of interviews. So we had a first round of Zoom interviews, and a second round where we narrowed it down to 2 finalists. And ultimately, we were looking at various qualifications of these candidates and what is their capacity to complete all phases of this project, from doing the statistical work, the public outreach, then the potential zoning and regulatory changes, and or I should say regulatory changes, regulatory recommendations. Mm-hmm. Any changes have to go through the planning board and then to a town vote. But yeah, so we were looking at somebody who could take on all aspects of that project consistently, so you don't have to work with too many different people in different places to coordinate.
Too many hands in the pot.
Yeah, to have that consistency and to have a staff of people who, in one place, who could handle that was really helpful. And then there's also just seeing in interviews and in the process who inspired confidence in terms of their abilities at public outreach, that you can get a good sense of in an interview, and having to talk to them, how they interact with you, who could really pull this off. And in the end, I think the Barrett Planning Group was a solid choice, and one that we're quite happy with.
And again, folks, be a part of the discussion. Go to the meeting on Thursday, April 6th at the elementary school in the cafeteria to join the planning board, Barrett Planning Group, and also the housing committee, and let your voice be heard. John, thank you for joining us here in Community Connections, and best of luck with the project going forward.
Thank you so much for having me, and I hope to see you all there on April 6th.
We'll see you next time here on Community Connections.